Hello. So when Superstorm Sandy tore through the Northeast almost a year ago, I was living in Brooklyn. I was working as a freelance filmmaker. And I was affiliated with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which at the time was largely dormant. It was a scattered network of activists who were mostly engaged with issue-based campaigns and solidarity work. But for most people, we're a distant memory. I was one of the lucky ones. I spent the night of the storm with friends in my house, eating stew and drinking rum like I was used to doing in Puerto Rico when there were hurricanes. And when we walked outside the day after, fortunately, there were only some knockdown trees, nothing major, and I was tempted to just move on with my life. A good friend suggested that maybe we should go out to areas that had been hit harder and help people out. And in what is probably one of the most regrettable, ironic moments of my life, I totally dismissed his suggestion, saying that we knew nothing about emergency response and we had no business going there, that we should leave it to the experts. Well, I'm here because fortunately, a reassessment of that first instinct led me to take part in a transformative process of people-powered relief work. But I'm also here because every year, 860,000 Americans are affected by disasters. And climate change effects throughout the world make us all vulnerable. So I think that it's time to rethink emergency response and to rethink how we will respond when those catastrophes come to us. Let me say first off that if I've learned anything from the past year, it's that in order to respond to an emergency, you don't need to be an expert. You just need common sense and perseverance. 2 days after Sandy, I drove out to the Rockaways Peninsula on the outskirts of New York City to help my friend out, whose house had flooded in this storm. And what I found was an image of devastation unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Smoking rubble from electrical fires that had taken out entire blocks, streets full of sand, pieces of boardwalk everywhere, people walking in a state of shock, a flood line on the side of every building. And what was even more confusing was the government presence that I saw around. I saw New York Police Department patrols just sitting, idling next to gas stations or protecting cell phone charging stations. I saw National Guard trucks patrolling up and down the peninsula carrying blankets and water. And at night, we saw armored vehicles from Homeland Security with soldiers in bulletproof vests and holding automatic rifles looking for looters. The first memory that I have of seeing any of these people outside of their vehicles talking to residents is when I ran into these Homeland Security agents pulling over 3 young black men who were walking home in the dark and making them put down their flashlights and put their hands up. Around the corner from my friend's house, I ran into some friends from Occupy and some friends from Greenpeace who had started handing out hot meals out of a community center that had opened 2 weeks before the storm. The place was aptly named You Are Never Alone. I walked over to say hi and help them hand out some pizza, and before I knew it, I was stuck there. I had fallen in love with a bunch of strangers, and I was involved in work that inspired me and made me feel purposeful. Our relief operation grew very quickly, and within a matter of days after Sandy, we had a solar truck that provided the only electricity in the entire neighborhood. We had a kitchen providing 3 meals a day. We had a flood of volunteers that kept coming in and helping organize and distribute donations. We had volunteers going up to high rises and knocking on doors and delivering supplies to elderly and disabled folks. We had teams going out through the neighborhood and helping neighbors pump out their basements, which would have cost them upwards of $1,000 otherwise. We spread throughout the peninsula very, very quickly, establishing relief hubs every 10 or 20 blocks, getting to know community organizations and church groups, youth groups, surf clubs, many people that had suddenly become emergency responders. We offered them our volunteers and our donations. We exchanged contact info. We kept in touch so that we could share information and updates. We also talked a lot to residents, and we listened mostly so that we understood their needs, so that we could share news, so that we could provide solidarity and comfort. There was a lot of hugging those first couple of weeks between strangers. By the third day, strangely enough, we were briefing city officials, we were getting drop-offs from the National Guard, and then when a nor'easter came and brought some early snow, Occupy Sandy, grassroots organizations, the NYPD, and the sanitation department were the only people out on the streets providing any relief. FEMA and the National Guard had evacuated for the day. By the end of our first week, our improvised relief hub in Rockaway Park had a free health clinic in a flooded-out Furrier. It had a kitchen in an empty lot. It had a meeting space and crash pad in a donated apartment. We moved out of the community center and started gutting it and rebuilding it while moving into a storefront that had been donated next door where we kept our equipment and we trained volunteers. Medical professionals were trained and dispatched from there, and they went out and found hundreds of people stuck in their apartments without medication, many suffering from illnesses like high blood pressure or anxiety attacks. It had been a week since the biggest storm to ever hit New York City, and we still hadn't seen the Department of Health, we still hadn't seen the Red Cross or utility companies anywhere. The city government had 2 medical vans stationed in the Rockaways and advertised online. For a population of 130,000 people, they had no heat, power, or water, let alone internet access. At the same time, other occupiers and allies were doing similar work throughout New York and New Jersey in impacted communities and in centralized relief hubs. The Occupy network reawakened immediately, calling on each other, calling on organizations that we had worked with in the past, and bringing people together to confront this new crisis. Just like we had done during the occupation in Wall Street, people recognized needs and shortcomings and assumed them as responsibilities. Thousands of new people that had never been a part of our movement joined us because they wanted to help. There was so much to do, and we grew so quickly that we grew decentralized, yet intimately codependent. Relief hubs on the ground operated autonomously in response to ever-changing circumstances, but connected to volunteers, to resources, and to donations through centralized hubs in the city. Coordination was mostly done through email and cell phones. Social media teams blasted out specific lists of needs. Occupy Faith contacted churches and asked them to be hubs. Translators Working Group made sure that all our essential information was available in different languages. Pro bono legal teams were assembled and hotline numbers were set up. Our process was and still is largely intuitive and imperfect, but our priority has always been to just help Sandy survivors in any way that we can. What holds us together is our shared love and rage, our love for each other and for the ideas that we're putting into practice, and our rage at an emergency response system that failed and that depends largely on unpaid volunteers to make up for its shortcomings. Ours was a laboratory of people-powered relief. So every day, we tried things out, we made mistakes, we learned, we changed, and we tried them again. Being mostly untrained, inexperienced, and not beholden to any institutional mandate or chain of command, we adapted with constant flexibility and innovation. As it turned out, our experience occupying Wall Street had prepared us for this situation. But you don't have to trust me on this. The Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which might sound a lot more legitimate to you than a bunch of hairy anarchists, says that vertically organized hierarchical agencies with clear organizational charts and streamlined channels of communication are usually not well suited to manage disaster recovery. By contrast, horizontally organized agencies can promote interagency coordination and information sharing, allowing individual groups to adapt to new contexts and information while remaining responsible to their parent organization. We learned very quickly that there's no way of responding to a damage of this scale except one human being at a time, and that everyone has ideas and skills that can be useful to our collective effort. One day, for example, a volunteer set up an online wedding registry where we could post exactly what we needed, and supporters from all around the world could click and buy it for us and have it mailed to us. Within a matter of days, we had thousands and thousands of packages at our door. Eternally unsatisfied and idealistic, as occupiers tend to be, we went on to develop a local business registry where we tried to channel that same money to small merchants in impacted communities. Sandy was not the worst thing that happened to a lot of people in the Rockaways. And perhaps their ability to cope is due in part to a lifetime of struggle and survival of economic disasters. A 17-year-old neighbor and volunteer confronted me with this harsh truth one night when I asked him, "What has changed in your life since this storm?" And he said, "Well, at least now I get 3 full meals." We were right where we had started, plugging holes in a broken system that puts attention on private interest instead of people, a storm that revealed that capitalism is the real crisis. The tide surge treats everyone the same, but class lines delineate who recovers and how. Our neighbors and collaborators included an amalgam of people long ago deemed invaluable to society and discarded and pushed out to the limits of the city. Some were mentally ill, some were disabled, some had crippling addictions. Many were ex-convicts and even more relied on pensions and welfare. There were retirement homes full of seniors. There were basements illegally occupied by undocumented immigrants. And there were public housing projects full of poor people, many of them elderly. These are the folks that couldn't get emergency food stamps after the storm because they had no social security numbers, or that couldn't cash their FEMA checks because they had no bank accounts. These are the folks that were abandoned in hotel rooms and homeless shelters for months, far from everything and everyone that they knew. The folks that weren't eligible or that refused that isolation then slept in freezing, dark, moldy homes or on the streets. These are the renters fighting uncaring slumlords that refused to make repairs, the displaced families looking for apartments that were suddenly twice the same price. These are the people that were getting their door kicked down in the middle of the night by cops because they had missed an appointment with their parole officer when there was no transportation to leave the peninsula, and one thing turned into another, and so on. Some of these people are still stranded. They're still struggling to rebuild their homes. They're still struggling to get their jobs back or to make up for lost school. The real disaster is not a natural disaster. It's a human disaster. What made a difference in the lives of people in communities like Rockaway Park wasn't the flood and the fire, but the opportunity to reimagine themselves and their community, to trade in old resentments for memories of solidarity. Rockaway residents who are grieving their own losses would come to us to charge a phone or get a flashlight and stay to help their neighbors out. They helped each other clean and rebuild. They gave each other moral and emotional support. And sometimes they even gave each other jobs in rebuilding or started their own Sandy relief groups. In her book, Paradise Built in Hell, the writer Rebecca Solnit explains that disaster reveals what else the world could be like, reveals the strength of that hope, that generosity, and that solidarity. It reveals mutual aid as a default operating principle and civil society as something waiting in the wings when it's absent from the stage. It's not about Occupy Sandy. All we did was provide a space for people to recover their empathy and their natural desire to care for one another. Sandy survivors got more acquainted with their own power and often reimagined themselves and their communities. National Guardsmen, FEMA staff, AmeriCorps volunteers, doctors, and nurses that volunteered with us on their days off did so as well. They came to reimagine themselves as well as their purpose in society, sometimes even confronting the limits of the organizations that they worked for or the interests that they were protecting. A representative of the Office of Emergency Management told me recently that it is their national policy that victims should not respond to emergencies. I think this is one of the basic premises that Occupy Sandy challenged and subverted often unknowingly. For starters, we refuse to treat anyone like a victim or call anyone a victim, because words mean things. It's hard enough to find yourself in desperate need and look out the window and see the logos of charities that you're used to seeing on TV. You don't need anyone's pity. Secondly, we acknowledge that the natural impulse of anyone who survives a disaster is to fend for themselves and go out and help their neighbors. Occupy Sandy just provided tools, people, and resources to assist in this process. We understood the importance of working with communities and not for them. While large NGOs and government agencies ferociously guarded their work and information as commodities to be traded for grants, Occupy Sandy shared as much information as possible, was transparent as possible in their finances, and incorporated residents into our decision-making structures. With no strings attached to any of our funding except our ethical standards, we were able to reach people who truly had nowhere else to run. We refused the mentality that disaster relief is incapable of addressing pre-existing socioeconomic problems, and imagined a recovery that addressed injustices that were exacerbated by the storm. What remains 2 weeks before the anniversary of Sandy? The visible destruction is mostly gone, but trauma and uncertainty about the future are still very present. In the Rockaways, the last hospital left in the peninsula is threatening to close its doors, but the boardwalk and the hot dog stands are back. Homes sit empty, most aid organizations have left, and studies indicate that around this time, residents that have been affected by Sandy and have yet to receive help will lose hope and probably sell their properties to developers and leave their communities. Through Occupy Sandy, we planted the seeds for long-term recovery and are still working to maximize the impact of our remaining funds. We've rebuilt the community center You Are Never Alone in Rockaway Park and are supporting them in developing job training programs and social services. We have also developed an incubator and microloan fund for worker co-ops so that residents can be the engines that restart their own economy. We have brought together residents to fight for a voice in rebuilding, to protest climate change, and to oppose the construction of a gas pipeline that would cross through the peninsula. More recently, we've documented our experiences to gather institutional knowledge that can be shared with others in similar situations. We certainly don't have all the answers. In fact, if anything, we have more questions every day. But I take comfort in remembering a cement truck driver who came over to Yana as we were building the floor in Rockaway and looked around at all the volunteers scrambling frantically to try to build a leveled floor. And he just looked at me and said, "Not bad for a bunch of amateurs." Not bad at all. Thank you very much.